Every night, Christians kneel beside their bed and pray, not knowing their own bedroom is positioned in a way that blocks their breakthrough. I have watched them for years. Heads bowed, whispers trembling through the dark, convinced they were being heard, convinced the heavens were recording every syllable. They rose each morning expecting change, expecting victory, expecting something to shift. Yet the same weight pressed on their shoulders again and again and again. They believed the silence meant patience was required, when in truth, silence was a sign of interference. I speak now because the time of looking away has passed. There's a warfare many never prepare for, because they assume the battlefield is somewhere far away, across oceans, in deserts, in distant cities. Yet the true struggle is closer, woven into the quiet of their own homes, into the layout of the very room where they seek help. There are choices made casually, where a bed is placed, where the head rests, where the feet point, and those choices form unseen gates. Some gates draw strength, others seal it shut. Every testimony begins the same way. I prayed, and nothing changed. But they never questioned why the air grew heavier with every request. They never asked why sleep became shallow, just as their spirit tried to rise. They never wondered who benefits from their exhaustion. I remember the first moment I understood. An old pastor spoke in a whisper, his voice trembling as though the truth itself weighed more than his lungs could carry. He told me, "The bedroom is an altar. The way you place yourself upon it determines what crosses into your life." At first I dismissed him. I thought it was another dramatic warning, the kind that fades once the sermon ends. But after hearing story after story, soldiers of faith who prayed with fire, yet woke up cooled by despair, I began to investigate what no one wanted to touch. I walked through houses where prayer had become routine, yet victory felt delayed beyond reason. I noticed patterns, the bed framed against a certain wall, the doorway positioned in a certain angle. The space meant for rest transformed into a silent barricade. Some arrangements channeled strength, others tangled it. Night after night, believers surrendered their hearts, yet the unseen lines of their room rerouted everything they released. And when I confronted them, when I told them what I saw, they laughed first. They said faith is enough, but faith without awareness becomes fatigue, and fatigue is the first tool used to wear a fighter down. I watched marriages crumble while prayers soaked the pillow. I watched sudden sickness cling to bodies that once ran with purpose. I watched financial doors remain sealed, though declarations echoed through the night. And all the while, the room stayed the same, unchanged, unexamined, unquestioned. I cannot stay silent now. The pattern is repeating again, more fiercely than before. Believers sense pressure, but cannot trace its source. They feel watched, but call it imagination. They wake in the middle of the night without knowing why the air feels colder around their feet than around their hands. You might think this is exaggeration, but there are things I cannot unsee. I have stood in a room right after a prayer that should have shaken foundations, and instead I felt a stillness so sharp it nearly choked me. It was as though an unseen hand pressed down on every word spoken, trapping them before they could ascend. There are forces that do not need permission to attack. They only need a structure that grants access. And so I confess this now, with the weight of all I have witnessed. Many are losing battles they never realized had already begun, not because they lack faith, but because the landscape where they pray has been arranged to silence their victory. The warfare you fear out there is already happening right where you sleep. And until someone exposes what interferes, until someone speaks of the gates hidden in plain sight, prayers will continue rising from weary mouths only to fall short, caught in the invisible lines no one ever told you to consider. I will go further. I will reveal everything. But first, answer this. When you finish praying each night, do you rise feeling lifted, or do you feel as though something presses harder the moment you open your eyes? Your answer will tell me whether you are ready for what comes next. Because the next revelation will not comfort you. It will challenge everything you assumed was safe. And once you hear it, there is no turning back. And I'm not talking about demons under your bed. I'm talking about a doorway in the spirit you leave open without knowing. People laugh when they hear that. They picture childhood tales, shadows, claws, glowing eyes. But this is no children's story, and the threat is never where they think. The greatest danger is seldom loud. It works in silence, in things you overlook, in positions you assume are harmless. I didn't understand at first either. When the old pastor spoke to me, he said, "You think warfare begins when you speak? It begins when you sleep." His eyes were tired, as though he had carried this knowledge alone for too long. He told me of believers who placed their head where their feet should have been, who slept facing the wrong direction, who unknowingly aligned their bodies with invisible currents that drained rather than strengthened. They prayed with sincerity, but rested in a posture that surrendered more than they realized. He said there were testimonies he could never share publicly, because people would accuse him of exaggeration. But behind closed doors, he spoke of dreams that felt like invasions, of nights where prayers were trapped at the ceiling, like birds beating their wings against glass, unable to escape. And he confessed that the strongest intercessors he ever trained all had one thing in common. They guarded the space where they slept, as carefully as a soldier guards the ammunition that keeps him alive. I didn't believe him until I visited a family who had prayed every midnight for a year, trying to break a cycle that clung to their bloodline like an inherited chain. The husband fasted until his clothes loosened on his body. The wife prayed until her voice trembled each dawn. Yet nothing changed. When I entered their bedroom, I felt something in the air that I still struggle to put into words. The bed stood in a position that seemed harmless to them, but something about its placement, its alignment between the window and the doorway, felt as though the room was divided into two territories. Their heads rested in the very corner where generations of frustration had gathered like dust no one ever swept. Their feet pointed toward the only opening through which their prayers could have risen, as though their strength left their bodies each night and never returned. The wife said, "Every time we prayed, we felt hope, but every morning we woke up with the same heaviness." And I saw it then, the invisible doorway they walked past every day without noticing. It wasn't marked by symbols or scratches or candles. It didn't glow or pulse. It simply stood where no one thought to look, quietly altering everything they tried to build with faith. That was the moment the old pastor's words stopped sounding dramatic and started sounding like truth. You cannot win a war if the camp where you rest leaks strength. He told me once, darkness only needs one entrance. It doesn't need permission, only proximity. And that sentence never left me. I share this now because too many believers think warfare only happens when their eyes are open. But the truest battles begin when their guard is down, when the body sleeps and the spirit remains exposed. They pray for deliverance while leaving the layout of their life untouched, unaware that the victory they seek is waiting on the other side of a shift they have never considered. I have seen entire homes change after one simple adjustment. A bed moved, a doorway cleared, a place of rest reclaimed as a place of authority. And with that change came breakthroughs that had been delayed for years. Dreams no longer shattered before morning, strength no longer drained overnight, prayers no longer captured mid-flight, but able to rise as they were meant to. You may think you've prayed enough. But what if prayer was never the issue? What if the position where you release your words is the very reason they return unanswered? I am telling you this because I can no longer carry the weight alone. I saw too many believers walk away defeated, unaware that the battlefield wasn't outside their home. It was shaped by their own walls. And now I must ask you a question that may follow you for the rest of your life. When you lie down to sleep tonight, will you be resting or unknowingly surrendering ground? I was once deep in witchcraft. I watched believers pray for hours, while one hidden habit canceled their prayers. What I'm about to reveal, most pastors never mention. I didn't enter that world by accident. I was led into it, step by step, through curiosity that turned to hunger, and hunger that turned to allegiance. I learned how objects carried meaning, how arrangements redirected intentions, how a simple placement of the body could attract or repel forces stronger than desire. I saw what others denied existed, because denial makes the perfect shield for those who wish to operate unchallenged. In those years, I witnessed something many would struggle to believe. Prayers do not only rely on words, they rely on placement, posture, and pattern. Most believers mastered speech, yet overlooked environment, and in the silence of those oversights, their prayers weakened. I remember the rooms where rituals were performed. There were no random choices. Every table, every candle, every direction mattered. Nothing was ever placed without intention, because intention guided flow. I learned that alignment is a signal, and signals either grant access or deny it. And while I was deep in those practices, I saw Christians enter their own warfare without understanding the terrain. They prayed against forces they could not name, while their own habits kept the enemy close. There were things they did every night that allowed interference before their first word ever left their lips. Some slept with mirrors facing their bed, without knowing reflections become a doorway for exhaustion. Some rested beneath shelves, overflowing with untouched items, not realizing dust carries memories of every unaddressed moment in their life. Some prayed with their head lower than their feet, never suspecting that order matters in the language of the unseen. I saw a man who prayed with fire in his voice, yet woke each day with tears of disappointment. He assumed heaven was ignoring him. What he never realized was that his gestures, small, habitual, repeated, gave permission to drain what he tried to build. He was faithful, but unguarded, consistent, but unaware, war-ready, yet standing in a room arranged like a snare. When I left that world behind, when illumination struck my heart like a sudden flame, I carried one truth with me that I could not shake. The enemy doesn't always silence your voice. Sometimes it only redirects where your voice lands. And so I speak now, because someone needs to finally say what has remained hidden behind tradition and routine. There are rules of engagement you were never taught, and ignorance of those rules is why many feel a pressure in their sleep, a heaviness after prayer, a delay that makes no sense, a fatigue that clings even after fasting. The struggle is not only what you say, but what surrounds you when you say it. And the warfare intensifies in places of rest, because rest is where the spirit is most reachable, where barriers thin, where agreements are easier to form without speech. I must tell you everything, but the weight of these truths is not light. Once revealed, you cannot unlearn them. Once you adjust them, your life will never return to the silence you once mistook for peace. So before I continue, I need you to remember this. Your prayer may be powerful, but the room where you pray may have been arranged to weaken it long before you ever learned how to speak. The first time I saw it, I felt nothing. The second time, the room grew cold and silence erupted. The third time, a Christian woman almost lost her mind because of it. And what's worse, most believers still do this today every night in the same place they sleep. Keep watching, you'll see what I mean. I didn't speak the first time. I told myself it was harmless, just an arrangement, just a habit passed down without question. I left quietly, convincing my mind that some things were better ignored. But that night, sleep refused to come, as though something pulled at me from a place my thoughts couldn't reach. The second time, I stood still at the doorway, and the air felt heavy with expectancy, like the room itself waited for someone to make a move. No scripture was spoken, yet the atmosphere seemed to press against the walls, as if swallowing words before they could form. I realized then, this wasn't coincidence. The space responded to what happened inside it. But it was the third time that forced me to confront what I had been unwilling to acknowledge. I was called to pray for a woman who said she felt watched when she slept. Her Bible was always near, her prayers unending, but something tightened around her thoughts whenever she closed her eyes. She said her dreams turned violent, yet her days were marked by confusion. She would try to recall verses and forget them instantly, like her memory was being pulled apart, thread by thread. I walked into her room, and the moment I stepped across the threshold, my chest tightened. She stood by her bed, shaking, recounting how every night her mind seemed to break apart, just when she asked for peace. She prayed with fire, but woke up feeling drained, like her spirit was dragged through a battlefield without her consent. Her tears weren't of sorrow, they were of exhaustion. She said, "I trust God, so why do I feel powerless in the place where I lay my head?" I listened, really listened, and then I began to look around. Not just with my eyes, but with understanding I had once avoided. Her bed was positioned in a way that choked her prayers before they could rise. The direction she faced, The way her feet aligned with the doorway, it created a channel that pulled every spoken request into a void where nothing returned. She didn't realize she had aligned herself with a passage that drained instead of fortified. That night, we stayed awake together. She prayed, and I observed. Each time she raised her voice, she faltered. Her thoughts scattered, her breathing uneven. It was as though something pressed her mind inward until she could barely cling to a single sentence. At 3 a.m, she screamed. Not out of fear, but out of sudden clarity, finally sensing what had been happening to her all those years. I guided her to change the layout of her room. A simple shift. Her head aligned differently, her resting place moved away from the pull of the doorway. And then she prayed again. This time her words rose steadily, without interruption. No trembling, no confusion, no sudden breaks in thought. She slept that night, really slept, for the first time in months. And when she woke, she said the room felt lighter, as though something had been lifted from the ground where she used to lay. It wasn't magic. It wasn't superstition. It was the reality that certain arrangements strengthen your spirit while others weaken it. And so many believers unknowingly place themselves where their strength drains fastest, at the exact location where rest should restore them. I speak now because what I saw next confirmed what many have whispered, but few have dared to explain. The posture of your prayer matters. The placement of your rest matters, and the ground beneath your knees is never just floor. It is either a gate that welcomes reinforcement, or a gate that swallows your victory whole. If this unsettles you, good. Unease is the invitation to awareness, because what I am about to explain next is the part most people refuse to face. Why so many believers wake with headaches instead of visions, why their sleep feels like a burden instead of a blessing, and why the same room they rest in has become the quiet battleground where their strength is stripped. I remember the first visit as clearly as if it were yesterday. Her name does not matter now, only her struggle, and what it cost her. She was young in faith, fiery with zeal, the kind who spoke scripture with conviction that could move crowds. Yet privately she was losing ground. She prayed every morning before sunrise and every night until exhaustion blurred her words. Still nothing shifted. Every request, every declaration, every tear remained unanswered. Weeks became months, and eventually her confidence began to erode piece by piece. Her greatest fear was not losing her blessings. Her greatest fear was that heaven no longer recognized her voice. She confessed that sometimes she wondered if she prayed only to hear herself speak, because after each session she felt strangely empty. No clarity, no strength, no release. She said the numbness terrified her more than any attack ever could. She was embarrassed to admit it, but she reached a point where she whispered words instead of speaking them, hoping a quieter tone would hide how uncertain she felt. At night she begged God for evidence that she wasn't alone. Instead, sleep became a battlefield. Dreams that chased her, shadows she could not explain, mornings where she woke more tired than when she lay down. Her voice cracked when she said, "I do everything I was taught, yet it's as if my prayers reached the ceiling and collapsed back onto me." That was when she asked me to come. I entered her home with no expectations, no assumption of what we would uncover. But the moment I walked into her room, something in the air felt misaligned, not evil, but restrained, as if power had been pressed flat. Her Bible lay beside her pillow, pages worn from constant touch. Her anointing oil sat by the window, hardly used. A list of scriptures hung on the wardrobe door, marked with tears she never intended anyone to see. But it was where she positioned herself that caught my attention. Every night, she dropped to her knees beside the bed, wedged between the wooden frame and the corner wall. Her body faced outward, but her back faced the entrance, the very gateway through which presence, influence, and energy move. She sought heaven, yet unknowingly placed herself in the blind spot of her own environment. I did not correct her with theories or lectures. I simply told her, "Tonight, we will pray differently, just once, trust me." She agreed. I asked her to shift her posture, to reposition her body so that her face aligned with the entrance, as though she were standing guard over her own night instead of hiding from it. Then I asked her to lift her head before her words, so her voice would rise rather than fold downward. There was nothing dramatic, no loud declarations, no thunder in the room. just a simple adjustment, and prayer that flowed with startling clarity. That night, she slept without interruption, and the next, and the next. By the fourth night she called me, her voice trembling, not from fear but from relief. Her dreams no longer chased her, her spirit no longer felt dull or tired, her prayers no longer slipped into silence. She said, "It feels like someone finally unclogged the air." My words breathe again. But I knew the truth was deeper. Her prayer had finally been positioned to speak from a place of authority, not suffocation. When I returned weeks later, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before, the quiet fire of someone who finally felt heard. And yet, even as I walked out of her home that day, something pressed on my heart. A hint, a whisper, a warning. Her mistake wasn't the biggest one I would witness. There was another case, one that still lingers in my memory with a weight that words can barely carry. A home where faith was strong, yet the very structure of their nightly habits nearly tore their family apart. I wasn't ready to reveal it then. I'm barely ready now. But if you're still with me, comment, "I'm listening." Because what comes next is heavier than what you've just heard. But her mistake wasn't the biggest one. The second case nearly destroyed a family. I'll expose that soon. I did not understand the full weight of the bedroom until I walked into the home of an elderly woman who had prayed longer than I had been alive. Her voice was quiet, but her faith was loud. Every surface of her house held reminders of a life surrendered. Scripture verses framed on the wall, prayer journals stacked like archives of battles won. Yet her eyes carried the fatigue of someone who kept pushing yet never crossed the finish line. She asked me a question that still follows me. Why do I wake up hollow, as though I left myself somewhere in the night? I asked permission to walk through her home. She agreed. The moment I stepped into her bedroom, the atmosphere shifted, not in a way that alarmed me, but in a way that made memory rise like a tide. I had felt this before. Many times. Too many times. Bedrooms are often where believers speak their final thoughts of the day, believing the silence around them is safety, open themselves emotionally, unaware how exposed that makes the heart fall asleep with spiritual doors unlocked. Convinced exhaustion is the sign of surrender. I once thought faith alone guarded the resting place, but I have seen otherwise. Your bedroom carries the last energy your spirit touches before rest. The position of the bed, the objects near your head, the pages you leave closed or open beside you, these become more than decoration. They become signals that echo into the unseen. I remember kneeling beside that elderly woman's bed, gently touching the frame. I felt the weight of memories in the wood, years of tears, whispered frustrations, hopes that rose and fell like waves. But I felt something else too, something she never recognized, confusion in the alignment. She slept facing a direction that clashed with what she prayed for. Night after night, she released petitions upward, yet her resting position rerouted her strength sideways. It wasn't evil in appearance, it was ordinary, nearly invisible, but the effect was enough to keep her weary. Many curiosity cliffhangers began forming in my mind as I continued to study the patterns. Some sleep positions expose you spiritually. I have seen people wake up more tired than when they lay down, as though their spirit spent the night wrestling without backup. Their posture during sleep left them uncovered, like a soldier resting with armor removed in enemy territory. Some decorations carry legal rights, a gifted object, a family relic, an artwork chosen only for beauty. Sometimes these things hold history that was never cleansed. What feels harmless becomes a silent anchor. It doesn't strike, it restricts, it doesn't speak, it grants permission for interference. Most believers don't know where they place their Bible, weakens their prayer life. I have walked into rooms where the Bible sat underneath piles of clutter, where it rested near dirty laundry, where it was left open but unread so long that the pages collected dust that settled like resignation. The word deserves honor, not as superstition, but as alignment. Its placement reflects priority, and priority affects authority. These revelations did not come to me overnight. They arrived through testimonies soaked with confusion, stories of warriors of faith who spoke powerfully during the day, yet groaned through the night as though something drained their strength drop by drop. When I asked them how they slept, they shrugged. When I asked how they positioned their space, they looked puzzled. When I asked what hung on their walls or what faced their bed, they hesitated. One man whispered to me, "I thought I was just tired." But fatigue was only the surface. The deeper truth was alignment. Where the body rests determines how the spirit recovers. Share this with someone who wakes up spiritually drained. They may think the exhaustion is routine, but exhaustion that repeats without cause is rarely ordinary. I have spent nights pacing in silence, reading old journals, retracing stories of believers who endured the same emptiness and never questioned the room where they laid their head. I wrote down everything, every record, every whisper, every confession, until patterns formed like constellations I could finally recognize. And here is where the revelation tightens. The most dangerous detail is not the lighting, nor the objects. It's what your head is aligned toward when you sleep. Because alignment determines direction. Direction determines access. Access determines outcome. I will reveal everything about this alignment, what strengthens rest, what weakens it, and what shifts the entire spiritual atmosphere of a room. But first, there's a story I must tell you. A story of a man who prayed with authority, yet woke every morning with less courage than the night before. And when I discovered what his head faced as he slept, my hands shook so fiercely I nearly dropped my notebook. You will understand why once I tell you. But that comes next. If you are ready, say so. Because once I open this next chapter, there is no forgetting what you learn. I remember him clearly. His voice carried that tired sound you only hear from someone who has prayed for years without release. He was the kind of man who believed in waking before dawn, kneeling before his bed, and surrendering his heart each night. Anyone looking from the outside would have called him devoted. Yet those closest to him whispered a different description. Something is eating him from the inside. He confessed that every morning he rose with anger simmering beneath his ribs, though he could not explain its source. I prayed for peace, he told me, but I woke feeling like my chest was a clenched fist. Hope slipped away slowly at first, then all at once. His wife felt the distance growing. His children avoided the hallway when he was frustrated. And though he begged God for softness, frustration always returned before noon. He fasted, believing his hunger would clear the fog in his mind. He increased the hours of prayer, convinced that persistence would unlock what felt sealed. But the heaviness stayed. Nightmares crept into his sleep, faces he could not recognize, voices calling his name, shadows he could never catch. He woke drenched in sweat, fists tightened as if he had been fighting something unseen. He assumed these dreams were tests of patience. Yet each morning, rage rose faster than his words could restrain it. I did not interrupt when he finally asked for help. Instead, I walked into his house quietly and studied the room where he prayed. I noticed the things most people ignore, the angles, the arrangement, the silent witnesses in a space meant for surrender. He stood beside me, confused, unsure why I was pacing instead of speaking. Then I felt my steps halt on their own as my eyes fixed on something he never questioned. There, positioned directly across from where he knelt each night, stood a mirror. Tall, polished, cold. Its surface faced him without mercy, capturing every movement he made in prayer and sending it back at him. The first time I stood where he prayed, I saw it clearly. The reflection didn't just show him kneeling, it returned the posture of his battle back toward him. I asked him, "How long has this mirror been here?" He said it came with the room. "I never thought it mattered," he whispered. But I could feel it. That mirror was swallowing tension each time he prayed, holding his image, returning his expressions, reflecting his warfare instead of releasing it. His eyes widened when he realized the nightmares intensified only after he moved his prayers to that spot. Something in him trembled, not out of fear, but recognition. I told him, "Some objects in your bedroom reflect your spiritual atmosphere back at you, distorted. This confusion interrupts clarity and weakens your prayer focus." It wasn't about superstition. It was about interference, the kind that overwhelms the mind with noise until a person can't distinguish their own thoughts from the echoes of yesterday. We removed the mirror that same day. No ceremony, no audience, just obedience. Then we shifted where he prayed, turning him away from the wall that once held his reflection and toward a space where nothing mirrored his struggle. He prayed that night with unfamiliar stillness. Words came slower, deeper, almost hesitant, like a voice learning to speak again. The next morning he called before the sun rose. His voice was hushed as if afraid to break what he had just received. "My mind was quiet," he said. "For the first time in years, I heard myself breathe without pressure. I woke up without rage. My wife asked if something happened. I told her. Something finally lifted." And as he spoke, I felt that familiar ache in my chest. The ache that comes from knowing people hurt longer than they should, simply because no one ever told them what to look for. He shared his testimony at church a month later. There were no theatrics, no shouting, no trembling hands, just a steady voice confessing what silence had cost him. People listened with wide eyes, some nodding slowly as if pieces of their own struggle suddenly aligned. Then he said something I will never forget. "I thought the problem was my faith. I didn't know the problem was the reflection returning my battles back to me." I could see the congregation hold its breath, because his words weren't just about him. They were a mirror of their own private frustrations. His testimony spread quietly, passed from one weary believer to another, and many began examining their own rooms, their own spaces of surrender, their own unseen obstacles. But before they could finish their questions, I issued a warning. If this is shaking you, comment fire. Because revelations like this do not sit gently. They stir something deep and stubborn. They touch what people assumed harmless. They expose what has been ignored for years. And yet, mirrors are only the beginning. There is one object, one arrangement, one silent presence in the bedroom that blocks prayers even more severely, and almost nobody knows. I have seen strong believers crumble under its weight. I have seen the joyful turn hollow without understanding why, and soon I must speak of it. Because until that truth is revealed, breakthrough remains incomplete. But mirrors are not the final danger. One more thing blocks prayers even more, and almost nobody knows. The hidden mistake. They never thought their greatest interruption came from the gentlest place in the room, the very surface that carries their sleep, their sighs, their private thoughts. Yet I have witnessed this mistake more times than I can count, and every time it returned with the same silent outcome. Most Christians pray while lying or sitting on their bed, the same place where they release exhaustion, doubts, arguments, and temptations. Let me speak plainly now, because the hour no longer allows softness. The bed holds emotional residue. Every night, tears soak into sheets unseen. Every morning, worries sink into the pillow without a sound. Arguments echo even after both voices have grown quiet. Confession is whispered into the dark, yet its heaviness lingers when the sun rises. And so, when prayer begins on the same ground, the spirit is not starting clean. It is starting with the weight of the day clinging to it, yesterday's discouragement still sitting in the bones, the distractions of thoughts circling like vultures, waiting for weakness. I once heard an old intercessor say, "Your posture becomes your portal. If the posture is lazy, your prayer becomes heavy." People laughed, thinking she was being dramatic. But I saw what she meant years later. During a night I still cannot forget. There was a young man, faithful, sincere, who asked me to pray with him because he felt locked away from breakthrough. He prayed every day, every night, without pause. His voice was steady, his verses strong, but his progress was stuck like a wheel buried in thick mud. When I entered his room, the first thing I noticed was how he prayed. Legs stretched out on the bed, back against the wall, eyelids heavier than his words. I didn't interrupt him, not yet. I listened. His prayer tried to rise, but his posture chained it to his exhaustion. Before his prayer could climb, it wrestled his fatigue first. And fatigue is a battle that steals strength before heaven even hears a word. I told him nothing that night. I only watched. And what I witnessed shook me more than thunder. His voice grew softer with each request. Not because he doubted, but because his body remembered the last emotion he had released on that same surface: weariness. The moment he finished, he looked at me confused. He said, "I don't understand why I still feel heavy." And I realized he never saw what had been stealing from him in plain sight. When you pray on your bed, you subconsciously stay in the atmosphere of your last emotion. Your prayer battles your fatigue before it reaches God. Your spirit tries to lift, but your body anchors it to memories you haven't released yet. So I spoke to him, not as a mentor, but as one who finally understood the cost. Move one step away, I said. Kneel beside the bed, not on it. Create separation. Break the residue. Give your prayer a different ground than your exhaustion. He hesitated, just for a moment, then obeyed. The shift was small in distance, but massive in impact. When his knees touched the floor, something changed in his voice. The heaviness did not vanish completely, but for the first time I saw his words climb without strain, as though clarity finally had room to breathe. From that night on, he never prayed lying down again. And slowly, doors that once seemed sealed began to open, not because magic happened, but because alignment did. People think warfare begins with loud declarations, but real warfare begins by removing what muffles your spirit before battle even starts. So let me say this to anyone who has ears for it. Move one step away. Do not pray from the same place where you collapse. Create separation. Protect the posture that lifts your voice, because the moment you shift where you kneel, you shift what holds your prayer back. If you receive this, type, I receive. But listen closely now. There is still one more thing. Something greater than posture, deeper than residue, and older than every prayer you have ever spoken. The final position, the direction your head faces, matters more than you think. But let me anchor this with one last story. A night that changed how I view every bedroom to this day. She didn't speak of it at first. Her eyes told the story long before her mouth did. Eyes ringed with sleeplessness, edged with confusion, carrying a weight she could barely describe. A woman under pressure no one else could see. Every night she lay down in what she believed was her sanctuary, and every morning she rose weaker, as though something had fed on her rest while the room remained still. She confided that she could feel when the night shifted. An hour when the wind outside fell silent and the house seemed to hold its breath. That was when the voices started. They never spoke clearly. Whispers, fragments, syllables without form, like someone breathing words through a keyhole. She pressed her hands against her ears, but the noise wasn't coming from outside. It echoed somewhere deeper, as though her own spirit was being observed while she slept. She prayed louder, longer. She fasted until her body trembled. Yet every dawn she woke with the same problem: exhaustion that no sleep could cure. Her pastor said she lacked rest. Friends said she needed therapy. Family suggested herbal tea. No one told her the truth. She was lying on a battlefield disguised as a match. Weeks passed. She tried every spiritual discipline she knew: worship at midnight, declarations at dawn, psalms whispered into the darkness. But the pressure remained. The whispers continued. Something clung to her nights as though waiting for her to close her eyes, waiting for her guard to drop. Then came the turning point, the confession that changed everything. An elderly intercessor, a woman who carried decades of prayer in her bones, visited her home. She didn't ask about dreams or voices. She didn't touch the walls or open the windows. She simply walked into the bedroom, paused, and stared at the headboard. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Do you know where your head faces when you sleep? The woman shook her head. She had never thought to ask. The intercessor continued, her hands trembling with memory. Where your head rests is the direction your spirit leans during rest. And this direction, this exact one, was once used for offerings in your region. Altars were built facing that way. People called upon ancestors there. Requests were made there. Ties were forged there. In that moment, the room changed. Or perhaps she finally saw it for what it was. Her bed wasn't just furniture. It was positioned toward a history she didn't choose, and her rest was facing realms she never intended to engage. That night, she didn't sleep on the mattress. She knelt beside it instead, forehead bowed, hands locked together, not praying from habit anymore, but from revelation. Her voice didn't shake. Her breath didn't falter. And when she finally whispered amen, there was no echo, only release. The next morning, something was different. She didn't wake gasping. She didn't feel watched. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful. So she took the final step. She shifted the orientation of her bed, slowly, deliberately, as though every inch mattered. And it did. For the first time in months, sleep didn't feel like surrender. It felt like rest, the kind she had heard others describe but never experienced herself. Then the dreams came back. Not the confusing ones that left her drained, but dreams with direction, instruction, warning. Her mornings returned with clarity, and her nights carried insight instead of noise. What had once hunted her rest now fled from the moment she closed her eyes. Her testimony spread quietly, whispered through prayer groups and late-night calls, spoken between believers who had always sensed something but never had language for it. Some doubted, but those who tried it, they noticed the shift. And so she confessed, voice steady, gaze unbroken. I wasn't weak, I wasn't unheard, I was facing the wrong way. In that single sentence, years of confusion untangled, the battles, the exhaustion, the prayer that felt trapped beneath her own ceiling. Because the truth she learned, the truth that many still ignore, is simple and unforgettable. Your head direction determines what realm your rest faces. I didn't recognize the signs at first. All I knew was that something kept intercepting victories that should have already arrived. Prayers spoken with fire, outcomes returning cold, declarations shouted with conviction, results whispering back as delay. I once sat in a home where a woman prayed nightly for her son's freedom from addiction. Her tears soaked the floor beside her bed. Her voice cracked as she cried out for restoration. Yet every morning, she woke heavier than the night before. She believed the battle was outside, on the streets, in the temptations her son faced, but the breach was inside, merely 3 steps from where she prayed. The head of her bed pointed toward a window that had never been spiritually sealed. Each night, as she pleaded, what she released slipped right through the opening. Not stolen, redirected. Every word meant for breakthrough landed somewhere else, where something benefited from her exhaustion. I told her what I knew. Her hands trembled. She stood the bed. She anointed the window. She guarded the space she once neglected. 3 days later, the son who hadn't answered in months called home, asking for prayer. Coincidence, they said, but those who have seen too much know better. I have kept these accounts locked within me for years, afraid that exposing them would make me sound unbalanced, dramatic, desperate for attention. Yet every testimony that reaches my ears echoes the same frustration. I pray, but I don't see results. And every time I ask how they guard their room, there is silence. Not because they refuse to answer, but because they never once considered they should. You cannot leave a gate open and wonder why your harvest keeps disappearing. You cannot surrender in prayer and ignore the battlefield beneath your feet. You cannot invite the presence of God while leaving access unchallenged to everything that opposes Him. This is not superstition. This is not fear-mongering. This is warfare disguised as architecture. And once you understand that, you will never arrange your space casually again. I say this carefully, because if you listen to the next part, your nights may never feel the same. I promise you. There is a moment in time when the atmosphere is weakest, and a moment when it bends in your favor. There is an hour when your words land like weapons, and another when they fall like feathers. Most never learn the difference. Most pray when convenient, not when the gates are open. But if you combine the guarded room with the right hour, the interference loses its grip, and once that grip breaks, everything you prayed for begins to move. Most believers struggle not because God is far, but because their bedroom is unguarded. Now imagine if you also prayed at the right hour, the hour which is fear most. That's what I'll reveal in my next video. Until then, fix the room, fix your prayers. Share this with someone who prays but doesn't see results. Subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal next, most ministries avoid.